maybe while you do that, I'll start already with the usually the way to, but I think it's a nice critical mass. Everyone is here. So nice to see you. So, here's somebody coming. And I'll wait for that and then I'll jump.
Okay, that sounds good. And I better make sure I have power, actually.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Let's see. How am I doing power-wise? Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, then I'll start. It's just such a pleasure to introduce Renee Ater. And I think I can truly say, since you came to Brown as the provost visiting associate professor in Africana Studies, you've changed the landscape at Brown by offering a series of courses on monuments and memorials. And you've been extremely generous with your time. Obviously, tonight you're here and you've given so many talks. I know 2 days ago you were at the library.
Yeah.
And you've been really a wonderful colleague and really inspired new conversations, very balanced, insightful, full of historic knowledge that none of us had access before that you provided us. So I'm extremely grateful that you're here. And actually, she just taught a course upstairs, and I went in there and sort of disturbed the end of your class a little bit just to make sure you were there and the students might come down. And it's a course on one of the objectives in a nutshell is actually to survey monuments and memorials in Providence and ultimately Rhode Island. That's work that you had already started. A database of everything that was ever done to commemorate anyone in the city. And of course, that's a really interesting and highly charged enterprise. And I'm glad you're doing it, and we're supporting it as it's a multi-year project, I think. And so it's really wonderful. So Renee came to us from the University of Maryland, where she, after getting her BA from Oberlin College, then she went to University of Maryland to get her MA and PhD, and then started teaching there from 2000 to 2017 when she retired there, and then she came here in 2020. And she has, as I said, taught a number of classes on the intersection of race, monument building, public space. She wrote a book on Keith Morrison in 2005, and another one, Remaking Race and History, the sculpture of Meta Warwick Fuller. They came out with the University of California Press and was so successful that it was re-edited as a paperback. No, it's just your computer, I think, falling asleep, big thing. Yeah. And she has written a lot of essays really on that question of commemoration, on memorials, and our struggling with our coming to terms with our history in this country, which is just an enormously fascinating topic. I took a class, our MA students, to Berlin last year, and we talked about it when we first met. It's a very interesting comparison to see how different countries deal with their past. And you were right in the thick of it and analyzing and thinking about it. You've written on a lot of public monuments, the Unsung Founders Memorial at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, African American Civil War Memorial in Washington, D.C., the Martin Luther King Memorial in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site in Alabama, and many, many others in Montgomery, and also in Boston, the Crispus Attucks Memorial in Boston, and the Boston Massacre, and others. So I really honestly feel you are one of the key figures to turn to if one is interested in this really burning question of how to address our past through monuments, memorials, through architecture, through urban space. And so I'm very excited that you're here and grateful that you give a lecture to this audience. So please help me welcome Renee Ater.
Because I'm notorious for talking and my computer dying during class. In fact, I have a kid this semester who seems that's his job now, is to say, Dr. Ater, your computer is dying. Can you plug it in? It's kind of funny, actually. He reminds me every week. It's wonderful. So I'm super pleased to be here. What I thought I would do today is to just talk a little bit about the shape of this project that I'm working on now, which is a digital publication that I am working with the Center for Digital Scholarship here at Brown with Allison Levy, who is the head of they now have a new name, but the Digital Publication Initiative here that was funded by Mellon. And so this is a very a complex project that I'm trying to sort out, but I thought today what I would do is give you a little bit of the scope and talk about what I mean by memoryscapes of slavery and then to actually do a case study. So you can kind of see how I'm thinking about space and monument. I'm a trained art historian, so I should say that out loud, but I am someone who has really moved off the postage stamp of art history to a certain degree, and I'm very interested in kind of interdisciplinary approaches to thinking about monuments. I turn a lot to cultural and social geographers who I think are doing some of the best works on monuments right now, but I'm also interested obviously in memory studies, and actually in ethnography and the idea of multi-sited research and what does that mean to look at multiple sites in the United States and try to extract some more general meaning about how we are attending to slavery in the landscape in the United States. So let me get into a little bit. Yeah, there we go. So I have actually also just for information, have a much larger database project that I've been running now for about 4 years called Contemporary Monuments to the Slave Past. It has about 160 monuments from across the globe. It started out as a database that really focused on the US. And then I decided, because I was getting inquiries from other countries saying, well, why am I not in your database? I'm not kidding. People write me like, can you put my monument in your database? I just got an email actually from someone in the government of Suriname, of all places. And so people are turning to the database as a kind of source of information, of description. I have all photographs in there. It's open source, so you can download any of the content. The National Monument Audit has used this database to determine that Harriet Tubman is the most recognized woman in the American landscape. There's about 18 monuments to Harriet Tubman and more coming, actually, one in Newark and one in Philadelphia. So I describe, and I'm gonna try to, it's hard for me not to just talk and talk and talk, so you just wave when you want me to shut up, because I have lots to say about this material. But I thought I would begin by telling you what I consider to be memoryscapes of slavery. And I'm pointing to a monument that is called the Slavery Reconciliation Monument or Memorial in Richmond, Virginia. There are 3 of these, and they are meant to mark out the triangular trade. There is a monument that is in Liverpool, England, and one that's in Benin. And so with each dedication, each group kind of went to the city. So the Richmond folks went to the Benin dedication as they were contemplating, trying to memorialize really the slave trade in Richmond, which was one of the largest in the Mid-Atlantic states. So Richmond and Alexandria were central to, once slavery is abolished, they are essential to the eternal slave trade and to moving bodies across the land. So I became really interested in the ways that not only in the physical object, this is what got me started. I'm a sculpture historian, so I got really started by kind of interested in the physical object. But more importantly, I think in the last couple of years, I've been thinking much more about spatial relationships, about geography, and about the way in which these monuments kind of dialogue with each other, whether it be dialoguing in the United States with each other or kind of a global network of thinking about slavery right now. And that global network of thinking about slavery was really, and there's lots of problems with it, but it was really started by the United Nations, who had a huge kind of UNESCO project to recognize heritage sites tied to slavery around the globe. And I've taught about this in a graduate seminar I will offer actually in the spring. But I've been thinking about memoryscapes because it allows me really to think about the material and spatial dimensions of how the slave past is remembered in the present. Because that's what we're really talking about, is how are we doing this work of history for us now? How are we trying to make meaning out of slavery? Lots of the monuments I look at are tied to issues of social justice, of trying to rectify something that's missing. That is certainly part of it as well. So this kind of spatial material dimensions, but kind of constituted through real objects, right? Concrete objects, significant places, physical landscapes, and human interaction. So I'm trying to weave a bunch of different things together here in thinking about memoryscapes. I'm also really think one of the most important things that I can say is that it's not just that they're landscapes and there are objects in them and there's spatial politics, but there is a way in which there's these kind of interactions, right, between people, objects, and places. And here, sorry that's showing up there, but here you can see one of the memorials at the Whitney Plantation, which is dedicated to the Black slave experience in Louisiana, along the River Road, which is where all these plantations are. It is really the most significant plantation that deals with the history of slavery. Most of the plantations along the River Road do a really good job of glossing. They're still wedding sites, right? There's still places that you can go and actually stay in oversea cabins, at Oak Alley. So they're very problematic. And one of the things in this case that I'm trying to argue with this site in particular at the Whitney Plantation is that they're really trying to do an intervention in what I call kind of the white plantation landscape along the River Road. And it's significant, the kind of story that they want to center kind of Black life at the plantation. And particularly, this is the only site I work on where children are the focus. There's something about, I think about 1,200 children were enslaved and forced to do sugar production at this site. And so they want to honor that memory of the children. So I see memoryscapes as kind of this really big umbrella term that allows me to talk about a range of things. I have some questions that are part of my larger project, and they're on the screen. But one is, how is the slave past visually remembered and forgotten? Because with remembrance always comes forgetting. In the white monuments landscape of the United States. And I really do use that term white monument landscape not to offend anyone, but to really point to the fact, if you look at the National Monument audit of 45,000 monuments in the United States, just a sample, the majority of them are to white men and to war. Like, this is something that we all knew, I think, working in the field, but to actually have it kind of concretized in this report is really something. And it then talks about why this is so important to do these kinds of interventions. The other question is, like, who is responsible for remembering and for what is remembered? In my project, I have everything from, individuals who've instigated monument building to developers who are controlling what a monument looks like. And I really mean land developers, people who start to put in an office building, start digging, and then they find remains and have to stop. And then they have to figure out a kind of solution to the fact that they've uncovered, particularly in Alexandria, Virginia, they have to do a lot of cities have these kind of mandated archaeological processes that have to be put into place. So the question is, who is remembering? I was asked a question when I gave not quite this talk on Tuesday about, kind of Black geographies, and is this really about Black space? It's super complicated. It's not just about Black space. It is about the way in which multiracial communities are trying to wrestle with the slave past. Sometimes it's solely Black communities, but sometimes it's actually also white community members who want to actually have these really hard conversations about what slavery means now in the present. I'm also interested in the relationship of the monumental object, which is what I'm calling this thing, a statue, a monument, to place and to its surrounds, but also to, as I mentioned earlier, to national and global efforts to commemorate slavery. And lastly, of course, memory is the thing that is the connective tissue throughout of this. And I use memory really somewhat metaphorically to talk about collective memory. How do we as groups remember the past? What are the stories we're telling? I just taught a class about the Battle of the Little Bighorn upstairs, and kind of the stories told at that site is there's kind of a story about Custer being heroic and amazing, and then there's the story of the Cherokee and the Lakota, which is a completely different story of triumph actually over Custer, and how long it's taken the Park Service to sort out this narrative, right, and what story to tell. So this connection between memory and place shaped the narratives of memoryscapes of slavery in very real ways. And lastly, just to show you quickly how my digital publication is based on this concept of nodes, really of geography and moving from place to place. I have 5 thematic essays, including one on global memoryscapes that looks at the monument at the UN. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the Transatlantic Memorial that's on the grounds of the United Nations, meant to be a global recognition of slavery, yet completely now, because of 9/11, behind a fence, you've got to go through security, you've got to get a permit. So it's no longer really, in my mind, a public monument, but I have a lot to say about that. Today I'm going to talk very specifically about this resurrection of the slave cabin as a memorial object. And what does that mean to take an architectural thing and then kind of lay memory work on top of it? I have a chapter on the Whitney Plantation. And then I have become, quite frankly, absolutely obsessed with the destruction of Black cemeteries. I never thought as an art historian this would be something I would be looking at, but we are facing actually a mass destruction of formerly enslaved and freed cemeteries in the United States. There are other people working on this, but I'm particularly interested in this kind of reclaimed cemeteries after the destruction. And what I mean by that is literally in Alexandria, they used a black cemetery to actually extract the clay from that area, including the bones in it, to make bricks that built homes in Alexandria. So these are huge issues of kind of desecration and destruction. And what does it mean then to try to recreate memory around it about those who are lost? And then lastly, because I can't resist Harriet Tubman, I just wrote a chapter on her for a publication. It's kind of the idea of the Black heroes in the white monument landscape, and particularly the Underground Railroad, which is so tied to heritage tourism that I have driven from Southern Maryland through Delaware up through New York State. I've done the entire route to get a sense of what that means to participate in heritage tourism around slavery. But you can go literally, there's a byway, Underground Railroad byway in Delaware that extends from Maryland that extends into Delaware, that cuts across into upstate New York that are very significant, and then looping around the lake, Ontario, into Canada, in St. Catharines. So this idea that the way that we might think of a memoryscape can be like at this site at the college, or it can be a larger, much broader landscape, that really memorial landscape that stretches across states, trying to tell this story. And it's the liberatory story of the Underground Railroad that I'm most fascinated with. That we want that story because it makes us actually, you're able to kind of move slavery to the side with the Underground Railroad, because it becomes a story of valor, right? Of kind of someone like Harriet Tubman against all odds, helping 60 people to escape from the eastern shore of Maryland. It's a digital publication and not a book for a reason. When I first started this project, which is insane, a decade ago, I never knew I would be still working on this. I could not envision how to fit it in a book. Like the things that I wanted to do, particularly around mapping and both audio and video interviews, but also to create, I create these, you're gonna watch one, I need to edit it, but these videos of the monuments in situ. A monument's a three-dimensional object that is meant to be kind of encountered in a surround. And so I want these kind of layers in the book. I've started to think a little bit because I've become, every single one of these projects is in part motivated by archaeology. They've done archaeological excavations to actually kind of legitimize that there was a slave presence, and then the monument gets built. So I'm also really interested in this idea of layers and how the layers of both landscape but also monument building can tell us stories. So it's a pretty complicated, like multi-dimensional project or multimedia project. I'm on the first chapter. I just wrote the introduction. And so that is moving along. But what I thought I would talk with you, because I've gone to, I live in Washington, D.C. I'm a visiting professor. I live here in Providence, but also in D.C. And so this monument's in Southern Maryland. It's 90 minutes from my home. And it's really significant. And it actually could, and I probably will put it in dialogue with Brown's Slavery Memorial, because in fact, it's accomplishing something that Brown's doesn't in reality. So, I can talk about that at the end. But it's called From Absence to Presence, Commemorative to the Enslaved Peoples of Southern Maryland. And it's a really interesting story at this site. It looks like this. Here's a photograph of it. They deliberately chose the cabin form based on archaeological evidence and of slave cabins that are in this region that still survive. So they wanted to use a form that suggested the domestic space in which enslaved persons lived. So one of the things that makes this for me really different from other kinds of monuments I work on is what I am noticing is that we are seeing designers and architects, urban designers and planners and architects get into the monument business. I'm super fascinated by this. It is, and I also work on traditional, academically trained artists who are creating kind of your standard person on a plinth, right? Who are still working in that mode. But there's these designers, and really Shane Albright and Norman Lewis never intended to design monuments. That is not why they got into business when they got out of, I think, a design school. But they're one of the premier monument builders in the United States, which is fascinating. And they're working with a poet. And so this is a really unusual, that on these mirrored surfaces are etched the words from, and I'll talk a little bit about this, from runaway slave ads from Maryland. Maryland had one of the highest numbers of runaway populations because it was a border plantation, a border state, and there's so much water. right? So waterway escape and also along the railroad was actually possible. And so there's actually some very interesting things where slave owners in the 1850s are saying, why are our slaves running away? We treat them so well. And it's, well, no, you don't. Like, it's a system of bondage and people are running away for reasons. And particularly in Maryland, on these plantations, enslaved persons had more mobility than, let's say, in the Deep South, in a plantation in Louisiana or Alabama, partly because slave owners in Maryland hired their workers out if they didn't have enough crop coming in. So they are working mostly in tobacco, which recedes, but also in wheat becomes a huge cereal crop that's cyclical. So they hired their workers out. So why this monument? I was really fascinated when I heard about this because I have gone to historic St. Mary's City many, many times as a tourist. Has anybody ever been there to historic St. Mary's? Yeah, so it is a really bizarre place, personally in my eyes. It's a really strange place. But historic St. Mary's, if you look over here, where there's a ship, like a 17th century replica of a ship that sailed, but that entire field is the historic, like the original capital of Maryland in the colonial period. And the story really of Southern Maryland is colonial history. And I'm really fascinated by this because it effectively erases the antebellum and slavery completely from the landscape. There is a celebration of the kind of the exceptionalism of Maryland, that it was a Catholic colony, so it had kind of religious tolerance. This is the story they tell. It is supposed to be that kind of nice encounter with the indigenous population, which effectively they wiped out. So there's all of this kind of mythos that the state and also the site tells through historic St. Mary's. And so what I'm trying to do is give you kind of an aerial view because I see this monument as in dialogue significantly with historic St. Mary's cities. More recently, they've started to try to tell the story of slavery in colonial Maryland at that site. But having just visited about 4 weeks ago, they're still sorting this out, is what I can say. That red, I hope everyone can see that. That's the field that the university was gifted in 2006, not knowing that when they got that field, which they were going to turn into a sports field, they start to dig and they realize that they have a site that's probably a plantation site, but they also start to notice that there's been all of these rumors of a plantation in this area, and so they actually uncover lots of broken glass, which implies that there were windows and a pretty elaborate structured house, and they find 4 dwellings that they assume are the homes of the enslaved. So the landscape of Tidewater, Maryland really shapes also how we are to understand what this memorial is doing. And I'll just show you a few more aerial sites and then I'll need to get moving along a little quicker. Here's the university, which is on a massive expansion plan right now. They're building enormously. But they accepted this land in 2006 and then they were going to build a stadium and sporting fields, which is what they did. But they discovered in the process of putting that stadium that there was a slave site. So everything stopped. The president of the youth of the university was a Black woman, like Ruth Simmons, who really instigated this conversation. Without her, they probably would not have had this extensive conversation at St. Mary's College about slavery. What is fantastic about her, she said, I'm putting this right, we're gonna put the memorial right in that playing field so students have to walk by it every single day, so that anyone who comes to campus has this kind of encounter with the monument. They're an interesting site because unlike a lot of monuments I work on, they did this kind of combination of historical archaeology at the site, but also really delving quite deeply into the archives of Southern Maryland and at their college. And so they have put forward they have quite an elaborate text kind of explanation of why this site. And so one of the things, just so that you can see that you're kind of moving from this street, this parking lot here into the memorial space. And you land at this space that's trying to tell you about the history. This is a colonial site. It is not an antebellum site. What they discovered in the archaeology is that during the War of 1812, the British Navy promised freedom to any enslaved person in Maryland who would join forces with them. And so the entire enslaved community at the site picked up and left and basically self-emancipated. this is enormous, that this happened. And so they're explaining a little bit of like the multi-layered history of this site, that is not just a plantation site, but also a site of like self-emancipation, and what does that mean within the context of the university. Universities, as we know, I hope that you know, are just struggling over their slave and connections to slavery and to the real dollars of slavery that the endowments are shaped by. So here's and this is, I went a month after they dedicated it in 2020, so I went a month after that. So it's still not fleshed out. It is now, the grass is all in place. And they created this memorial that sits on a keyhole pad, which is interesting because one cannot enter the space. The whole point is that it's meant to be the interior kind of enslaved lives that we don't have access to. And so that we can kind of glimpse through the slats. And so what they use is ipa, which is a very hard tropical wood, along with incised stainless steel. Engraved with, if I can show you, if I can get up here, because I have. And then they also, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the order of my slides here. So they have these engraved stainless steel plaques, which I'll show you what this is. And then another label saying like, why this particular commemorative? Why a structure? Why not just a bronze sculpture at this site? And really arguing, and they were influenced, which I find fascinating, by Angela Davis, of all people, to talk about slavery. They're influenced by Angela Davis's writing in Women, Race, and Class, where she attempts to, she has several chapters about kind of slave life, and she's attempting to talk about that there is a domestic life outside kind of labor, and that there's personal experience in the context of the slave cabin. And so I'm not even sure how they extracted this quote, to be totally, I'm about to interview the artist. I'm really fascinated how they landed on this particular quote. But this is what's quite quoted on the panel. And it says, "It is true that domestic life took an exaggerated importance in the social lives of slaves, for it did indeed provide them with the only space where they could truly experience themselves as human beings." So they're trying to kind of reinsert this humanity back into this space. Now, what I want to show you quickly is my very loud, and I'll have to turn it down a little bit because it gets really loud. Sorry, it was a very, very windy day when I went. Let's see. I'm not sure I can. We'll just run it for a little bit so you can see it. Hold on. Sorry, the volume's too loud. Is this connected to an outside volume source?
Yeah.
Oh, it is? Okay, hold on. Let me pull it down there. There we go. So it was a super, super windy day, and I even had like a special mic, but it just couldn't cut down on that sound. Sorry. I'm going to do it one more time so we can get in full here. There you go. So one reason for using the reflective surface is, in fact, to see the words reflected back onto the cement around it. So there's actually a lighting source from within it, but also the reflective surface as well. One's meant to kind of experience this as a three-dimensional object. Every time I go, and I go almost every time I go back to my home, someone's left flowers. So there's a real engagement with this by someone. It's leaving, the flowers are right here. And I find this a lot of sorry, you can see I'm still learning how to use my thing here, my gimbal, but they leave these kind of offerings as a way of kind of reminding, I think, of a connection to this space of Black life in very interesting ways. So does everyone notice all this writing? And also notice the naming of people. This is really important. So this is a form, and here I'll stop this now because I think you've gotten a sense of the object as in three dimensions. What's really fascinating is more recently it's starting to really fade. And so actually the monument is doing this really interesting play now between being present and absent because of the wood is so light that it kind of is fading into the landscape. It's something I want to actually talk to the designers about. So here's a plan just so you can kind of see. This is the exact kind of overlay they had a local artist design. So there was an overseer house. They think there was a very simple plantation house and then some slave cabins, both on the side of the playing field but all across the street. Lastly, and the president was really interesting. I mean, she said many were surprised by the location, but that was very intentional reason why it was built on that land. because you can't ignore it. When people are going through those athletic fields, it is there in their face. I want that to give them pause and wonder, why is this here? So she wants this kind of constant engagement. They also have an annual ceremony that's about to take place that includes the college as well as the community members, and a kind of a contemplative walk from the monument down to historic St. Mary's City. They used archaeology in very real ways by having the undergraduate students work with Julia King, their resident archaeologist, to actually do post-hole archaeology, and they've recovered lots of ceramics and things like buttons and glass bottles. But it also, in this way, got students really invested in the project. They understood that what they were retrieving out of the ground was deeply tied to actually the existence of enslaved people on their campus before, obviously, they were ever there. But this use of archaeology is really essential. And then Historic St. Mary's Cities does this really interesting thing, and they call it ghost frames, or ghost architecture, where they will use the frame kind of to suggest the building that was there. And these are sprinkled all over the Historic St. Mary's site, which is a couple of acres. And the designers were really influenced by that. When they saw that kind of idea of the ghostly presence of the architecture in the landscape, they wanted to evoke that themselves. And then Sauterley Plantation is one of the places I think is effectively telling the story of slavery in my region, in Maryland and Virginia. They have a really intimate relationship with descendants. So around Maryland, what's really important about many of the sites, the descendants didn't go far. So that many of them are still living in this region, and that kind of connection to descendants is essential to storytelling. They're doing that at Madison. I don't know if any of you saw the James Madison House controversy. It was really around the descendants having voice. And here at Sauterley Plantation, they have decided that it is the descendants who should drive the narrative. And so they have formed some really interesting groups around producing history at this site. But they have fully restored their slave cabin at this one of them. And so they went into the site and they were really struck by the clapboard and wanted to kind of evoke that site, this very standard kind of architecture in Southern Maryland. They also, as I said, use this concept of erasure poetry, which is really to take a well-known text and create an alternative narrative in it. One of the most famous is the Declaration of Independence, where someone has turned it into a statement really about Black presence, where they've erased all the words but the ones that talk about kind of Black bodies in the Declaration of Independence. And they were really interested in like the potential for erasure poetry to tell a new story here. So one of the things they did was to hire Quentin Baker, who he's a remarkable guy, Seattle-based artist, who has worked actually with both Caribbean kind of texts about colonialism and settlement in this exhibition, and that's particularly about a visit to Haiti during the colonial era. But he looked at 125 runaway ads from the newspapers in Southern Maryland as evidence. And what he did, and here's one of these typical ads, but what he wanted to do, so here's William Washington Walton. He pulls out the name because he wants to extract that there's actually named individuals, right? So that's one thing that Quentin does. But he also is really interested in completely eliminating all of this kind of racial description of the body. Getting rid of that he is very likely well-made Negro. He eliminates that kind of discussion. So he's taking effectively the language of the white slave owner and trying to transform it into something that's empowering, an empowered kind of enslaved person's voice on the side of the building. And so here's an ad actually from the McCall Plantation, in fact, from where the house was seated. But there was such a surge of runaway. There's just literally, and the 125 ads are just touched the surface. There are literally hundreds of these ads, and there's now actually a database documenting them. So I thought it would be nice for you to hear. So when you go up to the monument, one thing you can do is take your phone and there's a QR code. And Quentin Baker has actually read every single one of these kind of new poems that are on the side of the building. There's about 10 of them. And so I do want to play it because I think there's something about hearing his voice that's super powerful to understanding. If I can get I might have to go, let's see. I had it here, let's see. No, I have to go out in order for it to play. Sorry, I'm kind of going back and forth here, but that'll work.
A complex, dark, confined, carried by law through the unreason of time, a copper-colored apprehension. Who said run first? Who called midnight home? That thick scar, that reward paid to the low, the black, the unbelonging. Now, notice is hereby given to the slow discharge of reason, to the defect of purchase and confinement. Your hold is frail and spare of flesh. We are the inner bone of a secret, broken for safe delivery, reunited undercover in a dark country. Now, notice is hereby given to the well-worn anvil, to the cotton weighing down the tongue. There will be no return. No dollars given for the lost. Still the side. Bury the fields under a homespun shawl. Let no eyes rest upon them. It is the ordinary, the cut, the collected, the stiff, the scarred, the laughing, the somber, the polite, the slender. We run toward a self-made shore. We lurk with stars belonging to a bright black crown.
So one of the most interesting things, I think, is that the sensorial experience, that there's this audio quality to the memorial, that one is meant to engage and listen to, like literally the walls of this cabin to come alive, like with the words of these ads, but to resituate Blackness in some very new ways at St. Mary's College. And I have 2 more slides and they'll be done and can take questions. But you can see also here, but one of the things that it does is that we're never allowed access actually to the interior, and that's very deliberate on the part of the slave owner, of the designers. What the 21st century designers were really trying to get at is the idea of that kind of constant surveillance of the enslaved persons on a plantation, and that perhaps a slave cabin provided some sense of protection from that surveillance, that constant surveillance. And so you're not allowed to enter it. And so I simply set my camera on one of the slats. But there's a constant play, right, of the words both on the floor, on the exterior, so that language is kind of constantly activated at this site and very much embedded in the monument itself. And then it comes at night. It's meant to actually suggest the North Star. There's a spinning kind of torque that happens here. And there's one light in the interior that kind of illuminates this exterior. So one of the things that I guess, and I'll just summarize, that I'm super interested in this site is first is how archaeology is being used, right? And as kind of a tool of both, it's really interesting, both a tool to like tell us something about the past, but also to draw tourists in. So there's really weird ways in which archaeology is being commodified by heritage tourism. And the other is this, or the second thing that I'm really interested in is these very diverse landscapes that are coming and clashing here. There is a colonial landscape that dominates the narrative. So what does it mean for the college to have reintroduced, like the antebellum period, to reintroduce slavery into a landscape that really people don't talk about slavery in Southern Maryland very much. It is really fascinating to go there to a number of these historic sites, particularly historic St. Mary's, where I remember I've gone so many times and asked about the fact that there are still sharecropper houses and so forth, and there's kind of a refusal to respond, right, to that. And the third is like, why are we making memory this way? Like, what does it mean that we want students to engage in memorial at this level? And that we're trying to create kind of social meaning around slavery through this memorial landscape as well, and through this object. And that students in particular at this college, they're kind of in some ways like Brown, where everybody has to read the social justice report, the first year. There is a way in which this is much more kind of embedded in the lives of students, both through partly because of their archaeological project there. But the last thing is I look at this cabin, but I'm really interested in why universities are doing this work. Why? I mean, they have to, I think. But there's much to be said in thinking about an object like this that is rooted literally to the ground, and compare it to something like what's happening up here with the Slavery Memorial at Brown. In the sense that it doesn't evoke the enslaved persons. It's really the idea of the shackle, right? The half-buried shackle in the ground, kind of broken and rising out of the ground as a contrast. So there's a lot of other kinds of sites that I will be kind of folding into this. But that's kind of the beginning of this project, and I'll just kind of proceed in thinking, really someone asked me, why did you pick these case studies? And part of the reason I picked the case studies that I have for my study is their connection to archaeology. Archaeology has been kind of on the periphery of my vision for a couple of years. And I kept thinking, why are all of these tied to this? Like, what kind of stories can we tell through historical archaeology? What does the evidence tell us? I mean, we find a few buttons in the ground and all of a sudden we have a slave site. Like, what does that mean? So that has really been a driving force for me. So I'll stop now because I realize I've gone quite long. And if people want to ask questions, that'd be great. And I think I'll just unplug this. Yes, please.
Hi, are there any courses being taught around that structure at that school? So it's there and it has a presence and it tells a story and it's kind of in people's faces, but then are they actually engaging in it in deeper ways to kind of have dialogue with students?
I was just talking to Julia King, who's the main archaeologist, and they use it all the time. I mean, it's become this kind of focal point for them, like real focal point, like a real discussions around this. I think the students, that use of it for archaeology, like the practice of archaeology is fascinating, and I want to interview students to see like what that experience was like. But I do, partly because they have this annual, they call it the Sacred Journey. And so every year, I'm actually like the way that they're trying to make the space sacred is also complicated and problematic. But they do have this annual walk where students come to it and are engaged in it and are talking to local ministers and to the local, particularly because there's still a very large resident Black community around St. Mary's, right, who are very engaged as well. Yeah.
I was reading last book, the book of James Young, I guess, on contra memorials. Mm-hmm. And it came to my mind when you mentioned the idea of forgetting that some memorials bring. So yeah, I would like to know if you think that this memorial or others that you're studying are particularly erasing some story through memorializing.
Oh, good question. We were just talking about this today. Well, they do. I mean, all monuments erase some story to tell another story. At least I think that's what happens with monument building. I think here what's so important is that they don't erase the story of colonial life in Maryland because that is so deeply embedded in like state tourism. Quite frankly, that this memorial doesn't, in that sense, erase that history at all. Like it's still very prominent when you go down there that this is a colonial legacy. And the fact that the monument actually is also part of that colonial remembrance process. But I thought you were gonna ask a different question because sometimes I do think monuments then allow us to seize remembering. Like they stop the Remembrance Act, right? Like once we build it, we can say, we did the memory work and move on to something else, right? And that happens a lot, like in that act of building that we forget very rapidly. And what's interesting, particularly at St. Mary's and at the Whitney Plantation, they won't let that forgetting happen through the way that they're using it in the classroom, through these very poignant kind of commemorative acts that happen at the memorial. Through a I'm amazed, like they have dedicated an entire website at the college to this monument and to explaining it they've uploaded their dedication ceremony, they have the president talking, they've got the archaeologists, like they want people to really understand why they did this. And partly they're looking, I'm also interested that people think that by building these monuments to the slave past that it will actually assist with social justice action in the future. Like that isn't every single one of these groups that are building these monuments, they say that. Now, whether it does it is a totally different story, but that's the motivation for many of them. Yeah.
I'm interested in like the linearity of time, that there is a colonial history and then there's an antebellum history, as if you had like a set of people who all just ran away and then a new set of people came in. Yeah. Like, doesn't the antebellum history build on the colonial history?
What's so weird about that area is how the antebellum history isn't told. Like this is the strangeness about it, is that you go down there and you know these are plantation houses, but the story really is a story of this exceptional colonialism. It makes no sense, actually. Logically, it makes no sense. But I appreciate your question, but that is in effect what they're doing. Julia King's written an excellent book actually about archaeology and narrative in relationship to the problem of the way that history is being told in Southern Maryland. Yeah.
And what is that called?
It's called Archaeology Narrative and, oh, there's a,
Okay, that's okay.
But it's Julia King. Julia A. King is her name. Yeah.
Yeah, this is really great. Thank you. Can you talk a bit about the intersection between materiality and memory and how just all these different approaches to materiality, especially as like more architects are sort of getting in the game, might offer like new opportunities and even might be way more successful at this memory work compared to like the traditional like bronze and very heavy
I
monuments.
actually do think the designers are more successful at the memory work. And I don't know that because one of the things I'm trying to figure out is if it's because they're actually dealing with the built environment and with structures that we are familiar with. There's a couple of these designers. Smith Group has done something also. They're based in, they're actually a huge DC architectural development group, but there's a team of them that built also a memorial that I'm like, but you just built the hotel in my neighborhood, right? Like, why are you building this other? But it's that I think that they understand, and I don't want to knock a traditionally trained academic sculptor, but I think they understand space in really different ways than an individual sculptor. Like I talked to this guy, Mario Chiodo, who is an Oakland-based, Italian-American. He is a character, but he has a very lofty idea of what his monuments is doing. And he's like, well, I just build it and then they tell me like who's gonna do the gardening and where it's gonna go. He's a monument, he builds objects. He's less concerned with those broader issues about space and place. Like place is super important, I haven't said that explicitly, but of course you build a monument at a place because it's significant, right? So I do think, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but that idea of the architect or designer, they just are thinking differently than a trained sculptor. Yes, please.
When we were St. Mary's, there's in Maryland, I'm not quite sure.
Oh, it's too bad. It's so funny. I had a map in my last.
Sorry, I switched off the.
No, it's okay. So if you think about southern slope to east, so if Baltimore is at the top of the bay, and it splits down like this. Southern Maryland's here, and Point Lookout's there. There's a really famous submarine base there. The Eastern Shore, you go across the bridge, is the Eastern Shore of Maryland, like Cambridge. And if you keep going, you're at the beach in Delaware. So you don't actually have to go across the Bay Bridge to get to Southern Maryland. You drive down 301 to 5, and it takes you through the rural countryside. And one of the things that people talk about the landscape also down there that they're like, it looks exactly like it did in the colonial period. I'm like, what are you talking about? Like humans have been interacting with this land for 400 years. It doesn't look exactly the same, but there's a desire to like root place as unchanging in Southern Maryland that I'm really fascinated with. Yeah.
So I know this place because I actually lived in Maryland. I was working in DC, so I had a house in Maryland for a few years, and didn't really understand the history or the social history that well until I went out to Assateague and started seeing Confederate flags. And it just really threw me for a loop that there is like this very clear divide, and I'm wondering if you're addressing any of that like social history about how people think about that place broadly as still a Confederate place.
Because they just removed a Confederate monument from Talbot County, right? So it's an area where I actually work on a Harriet Tubman monument. And they finally removed it, and it has just made that community split in half. I mean, it is such a controversy over taking it down. And we also need to remember that Maryland sent Confederate soldiers to the Civil War. I think people forget this, that is a border state. So Western Maryland is kind of pro-Union, but Southern and Eastern Shore is deeply rooted in the Confederacy and lots of Confederate flags. So yeah, I have to deal with that. But the Eastern Shore has actually a little bit different feel, even more so with that. And I don't know if that's because of the way this area is now functioning as a military base, so it has a very different feel to it now than the Eastern Shore, with more, smaller. The Southern Maryland is actually a little smaller chunk of the state as well, but it's bounded by the Chesapeake Bay and the St. Mary River. I mean, all of that. The water, it's watery. But yeah, no, this is something I have to actually think about. But so this is a dilemma in my project. I don't want to talk about Confederate monuments. That is not the goal of my project. I know a lot about Confederate monuments for someone who doesn't work on them because I get asked about them a lot. But that is not the goal of this project. I think I have to do a little framing, but I'm not as, so if it comes up as a question or, it's what's amazing, it's never been vandalized.
This one.
No.
Oh, yeah.
So that to me is pretty interesting. It sits in this field, there's cameras on it, but all sorts of action could happen around it. And it hasn't happened in the 3 years it's been in that space. So I think that there's a way in which they educated the community fairly well in the surrounding area. But yeah, no, those become, with every monument I work on, the Confederacy is always there, you know? Yeah. Yes.
I'm struck by the contrast between more traditional figural monuments versus the one you showed, and especially the fact that it has this reflective surface that, I mean, I imagine if you're walking around it,
You're supposed to see yourself in
and
it.
I'm just wondering if, with these types of, monuments to these sort of hidden histories in a way, in your view, is there more of a need to create a work that's more, in a way, engaging or confrontational to the contemporary viewer as opposed to just cementing some kind of precedent? Is there a sort of need to be more?
I think that with the case studies I've selected, there seems to be like the form really matters in that, trying to both reveal hidden history, but also there is a need to be confrontational in the landscape, right? To tell a different kind of story. So I do think that's part of it as well. I mean, you're right. I mean, that's exactly what is going on with them. But still, I don't want to say people still want bronze statues. We like our bronze statues. I mean, I keep thinking we're like going to get over the bronze statue thing. I'm not a huge fan. I'm not. But because they're readily, in some ways people think they're more legible, right? We think we understand the human body. So if we see this human body in space, somehow that legibility, we somehow think the meaning is more self-evident than if it's a conceptual monument or this monument that's really asking you to see yourself. I mean, it's based on, of course, on Maya Lin's, that reflective surface. Like her reflective surface has had, like the long influence of that memorial is huge. But that reflectivity, like when I'm walking around it with my camera, I see myself at every angle in that space. And so I have to think about myself in relationship to the runaway slave ads, in relationship to the enslaved persons that may have lived there, in relationship to the very land. One of the last thing that I'll say, and then we should probably wrap up, is that one of issues that also is a parallel issue that I have to sort out is what do I do that all of these monuments are built on indigenous lands, right? So that in Southern Maryland, the indigenous history is very deep at this site. And while they're digging up buttons, they're digging up, other kinds of, particularly arrowheads and stuff are coming out of the ground. So that there's multiple layers of history at almost every site I work at. So their memoryscapes that they're of slavery, but also there's a whole indigenous history that's lurking there as well. So I think the confrontation is part of getting people to see a different kind of story in the landscape, a different kind of history. Now, whether or not we keep doing this, I'm not sure. Given the political climate, people may decide not to continue to build monuments. What I have been surprised that there are 130 communities that have chosen to build a monument. That's significant to deal with in some way this legacy of slavery, particularly in the United States. That's significant that people are having super complex and very contentious and hard conversations about what these monuments should look like. Yeah. Did that answer?
Yes.
Sure. Okay.
Thank you. So before I thank Renee, I just wanted to say the usual. This is the moment where we invite you to continue the conversation next door over nice food. I think it's some Chinese version and some other food was very good today, and good wine and sparkling water. I wanted to say two things. One is that you talked about collective memory and how to do it. And I would like to say that talks like yours are a big contribution to creating this collective memory as well. It's not just memorials, it's also the educational role that you play, like you've played here. And I've heard many of your talks over the time that you've been here, many on Zoom, unfortunately, also in person. But
the Zoom talk.
It always leaves me, your talks always leave me with a really positive sense that there's something really amazing coming out of the change we've been witnessing and this sort of reckoning with our history, amazing works of art that you find and present to us. And I think that's and as you just mentioned, large numbers of communities engaging in this conversation, which is always so wonderful to hear. So I wanted to thank you. It was really a great talk. Thank you very much.